Welcome to Quadriga. The eyes of the world have been on Hong Kong this past week, as more than 1 million people thronged the city center to demand the government retract a proposed law that would allow extraditions to mainland China. Police responded with tear gas and rubber bullets. The rallies stunned Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam, who has now apologized and suspended the unpopular proposal. But the protesters want nothing short of her resignation and full cancellation of the legislation. They fear that it could become a long arm for Beijing to apprehend political opponents and undermine Hong Kong's autonomous status. Hong Kong versus Beijing, power grab postponed? That's the question we're posing on Quadriga today. And here are the guests who will be answering it. Born in Hong Kong, Sherry Chan works mainly for DW's social media department. She says the fresh round of protests serve as an important reminder for people in Hong Kong that they still have a battle to fight until 2047. It's also a pleasure to welcome Andreas Kluth. He is a freelance journalist and author who formerly worked with The Economist based in Hong Kong. He says, despite the heroic resistance of Hong Kong's people, and especially its young, China will eventually limit and then extinguish Hong Kong's liberty. And finally, we're very pleased to have with us the activist Ray Wong. He was involved in the umbrella movement that emerged during the Hong Kong democracy protests in 2014. He was granted asylum in Germany last year. He says, "We don't want Hong Kong to become just another city in China." So welcome to all of you. Let me ask you, Cherry, to start out by talking a little bit about the current situation. Even after the suspension of the proposed extradition law, the protesters have made it clear they're not calling it quits. Apparently, messages have been circulating on social media, you're a social media expert, calling for protesters to escalate their actions, quote unquote. What could that mean? What are you expecting?
The protesters are now organizing new rounds of demonstrations, and I think they don't expect to have such huge numbers as the 2 weeks before. But then they said that they wouldn't back down unless the chief executive said the bill will be withdrawn totally. And they also demand the police to withdraw the charges on the protesters who were arrested. So we are seeing like a huge round of demonstration again.
Ray, would you say that Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, that her apologies and her suspension of the legislation was a genuine climb down, a genuine retraction, or is the government just biding its time?
Yes, I think actually the government just buying the time to let the whole case cool down in the international community. Because last week, 2 million people on the streets, and it drew a huge attention from the international community. And like the US, Donald Trump has said that he would raise the issue of Hong Kong in G20. I think it gives a huge pressure to the Hong Kong government.
Thank you, and we will come back to pressure from outside a little bit later on. But Andreas, for those of us who are less well acquainted in with Hong Kong, it may have seemed a bit surprising at first that what appeared to be a procedural law would provoke this level of mass resistance. In fact, you called it heroic resistance. What exactly is at stake, and why is it that you think this heroic resistance is likely to prove futile?
Well, that's a lot. I mean, what was at stake? This was an idea. The idea is to allow the courts to extradite people to China or Taiwan with whom Hong Kong doesn't have an extradition treaty. Has been around for a long time and never went anywhere. And then there was a case about a Hong Kong couple, very young, went to Taiwan and came back, that gave Carrie Lam, this puppet of Beijing, the excuse to suddenly accelerate that, which made everyone think that she wants this not to extradite the alleged murderer, it was a murder case, to Taiwan, because, by the way, Taiwan said, we don't want this anymore once they figure it out, but to open a back door into the Hong Kong judicial system, which is based on English common law and still is pretty clean, but to let people be extradited to mainland China. And once people made that connection, they realized that this is probably the most profound threat of many threats since the handover to Hong Kong liberties. And that's where they took to the streets in a way that I think is nothing short of heroic.
And why is it you think that heroism won't actually count in the long run? You said essentially that it's futile.
The Chinese, the mainland Chinese, from a Western point of view, are famous for their long time horizons. There's even apocryphal jokes about that. But they waited 100 years to get Hong Kong back in 1997. Then they made a deal for 50 years. And at the time, we in the West were hoping, well, a lot can happen in 50 years. Maybe Hong Kong will change China more than China will change Hong Kong. It's now completely clear that times have changed. China is standing up to the U.S. in a trade war. They want to turn islands into aircraft carriers in the South China Sea. They're really seizing what they view as their historical prerogative to be a major power. And everything points to a crackdown by Xi Jinping, who doesn't want to lose face. And I think the long-term direction is we're going to slowly turn up the heat. And then in another, it's been 22 years since the handover. Come 2047, I think it's curtains.
So, Carrie, your opening statement describes the protests as part of a battle that Hong Kong has to fight until 2047, until that deadline that Andreas just described. He's saying the battle has already been lost.
I think most Hong Kong people wouldn't think that this time they have a victory because Carrie Lam suspended the bill. But then it's a reminder for them that it's not only the bill they are opposing, it's actually the whole system behind, the whole fight for democracy, the whole how to retain one country, two system in their daily lives. And I think, as you have mentioned before, in 2014, there was a big protest, the umbrella movement. And after that, since no obvious outcome has been achieved, I think after that, many Hong Kong people actually lost hope a bit and they lost the momentum of what they are fighting for. But then this fresh round of protests remind them that this is a very ongoing fight. This is a long battle that they have to keep coming out again and again to voice their opinions.
I want to talk in just a moment about the link between the 2014 protests that you were so much a part of, Ray, and the ones we're seeing now. But let's hear the voices now of some of those who were out on the streets of Hong Kong this past week and who clearly believe that this battle must be fought.
We must teach the children to tell right from wrong. Hong Kong students came out peacefully to express their opinions. Even though they were a little impulsive, the police should not use rubber bullets, tear gas and beanbag rounds to deal with the students.
It's just a delay, not a full cancellation of the change in the law. So I think this is not over until this is a complete stop to those plans.
What more can we do? They call us rioters, but our gear is just a raincoat and a helmet. But they have batons, and they can make us bleed.
I don't think that we young people came out to cause trouble. We are fighting for a better future for Hong Kong.
So, Ray, those voices must sound familiar to you. Tell us a little bit about your experience during the 2014 protests, whether you think they made an impact, whether you think they made a difference, and perhaps what you would want to say to these protesters today.
First of all, I think there is a big difference between the protests in 2014 and the protests today. In 2014, actually, we gain nothing from the government. And even though we have stayed in the streets for 79 days, but actually the government didn't listen to us, didn't listen to our voice for democracy. But this time, the method or the way of protesting is different from the 2014 umbrella revolution.
Why is that? Larger or more willful, or what makes it different?
I think the biggest difference is that this time there is no significant leader. So every protester, they have their own voice and they do what they think is useful to protest. Yeah.
Very interesting. So would you have a message to those young people we just saw on the screen?
I would say now the political situation in Hong Kong is totally different from 2014. As Carrie has said, after 2014, a lot of Hong Kong people lost a bit hope in Hong Kong. But after this time, we can see the international attention is very useful to give pressure to the Chinese government as well as the Hong Kong government to change their mind or to make a bit concessions. So I think all the protesters in Hong Kong should keep their hope and try their best to tell the international community what's happening in Hong Kong and how important of Hong Kong.
Carrie, how far would you expect the government to go to suppress protests if, as you said, there are continuing rallies, escalatory actions even? What do you think the government's likely to do?
I think the suppression of the protests will only be justified if there is clash and violence or clash between the police and the protesters. And so as long as the protesters, they keep their calm and remain peaceful, I don't think the government has a reason to stop people going on the streets just to say things that they wouldn't like. And so we will have to see what the protesters' plans are. But I wouldn't say the government would make a lot of efforts to disperse the people.
Andreas, it's sometimes difficult to get a reading on Carrie Lam, at least I find, the chief executive of Hong Kong. At times, in the beginning, she sounded like the mother of a recalcitrant child, very strict. Then, when she apologized, she actually sounded at least genuinely distressed. You said she's a puppet of Beijing, so she's simply acting on Beijing's marching orders, meaning it wasn't she who blinked, it was Beijing?
She claims that the extradition idea was her own idea, but of course, I wasn't even making this an ad hoc attack against Carrie Lam, who seems to be a sort of colorless bureaucrat for the most part. But the truth is, all of I arrived in Hong Kong, that was Tung Chee-hwa, and then I still had Donald Chang, and then I left, and there have been a couple of since. They're all puppets of Beijing. That's the way the system is set up. That's what you guys were protesting against. You wanted to elect them and Legco, but also the chief executive directly, and they're not. So, of course, it is understood that they're there in part to represent the interests of Beijing, and that's not against Carrie Lam. I think if she were to resign, which could happen as we speak, there would be a new puppet. It wouldn't solve anything, as far as I'm concerned.
Ray, Joshua Wong, an activist who played a leading role in the 2014 protests and was then sent to prison, has just been released. He says the demonstrators are rallying now so that, quote, unquote, they don't suffer the same fate as the students on Tiananmen Square 30 years ago. Is such a crackdown imaginable in Hong Kong, a Tiananmen Square-type crackdown?
Actually, on the first day of the Umbrella Revolution, I had this thought, because there were rumors that the tanks from China were crossing the border and police were holding the gun pointed to our face. I think once the international community has no interest in Hong Kong, China, they can do whatever they want in Hong Kong.
Very interesting. So let's take a look then at the link between Hong Kong and China. Hong Kong, in fact, has long served as a bridge between China and the world, acting as a conduit for trade and investment in both directions. Let's take a closer look at relations between the two and what that means for the rest of the world.
Boasting over 7 million inhabitants, the Special Administrative Region of Hong Kong is one of China's most important trading hubs. When Britain transferred sovereignty of Hong Kong to China in 1997, Beijing agreed to guarantee the existing political and economic systems for 50 years, according to the principle of one country, two systems. Hong Kong's autonomous status guarantees civil rights such as freedom of the press and the right to protest. But these are under increasing threat as Beijing's influence continues to grow. Only half of the 70 seats in parliament are elected directly. And Chief Executive Carrie Lam was appointed by a largely pro-Beijing election committee. Arrests of the pro-democracy activists, such as the recently released Joshua Wong, are also increasingly frequent. Will Beijing stick to the pre-transfer agreement?
So let me pass that last question straight on to all of you and start out with you, Carrie. Do you think that the agreement will hold even till 2047?
In my opinion, I think it will. All these things that China is trying to do now is not to push the deal to be reached like earlier. I think what they want to do is just to make sure that gradually and slowly, Hong Kong will become more similar to just other cities in China, and their power to govern the Hong Kong people will be less obvious just before the deal is reached. And so they just want to have this gradual change so that in 2047 it would be like a peaceful and gradual change of the systems. But yeah, obviously Hong Kong people are not buying that.
Andreas, you're clearly skeptical about the agreement holding in the long term. What about the short to medium run?
Well, not necessarily about the agreement holding on paper, because remember that point about the time horizons. It's never been in China's interest to have a Tiananmen Square on the streets of Hong Kong, because one thing that from China's point of view, that it always wanted one country, two systems in both Hong Kong and Macau to be, was two demonstration projects for Taiwan. They were hoping to convince Taiwan, look, if you ever want, they want to gather all the Chinese lands back into the mother country, basically. And for that, they need to show that, look, we stick to agreements. Otherwise, they can kiss Taiwan goodbye. It may be that Xi Jinping has now decided, well, Taiwan is gone anyway, so it doesn't matter. I think what could flip it is if Xi Jinping, who's made himself basically dictator for life recently, he changed the Chinese constitution. If he thought he was losing face, he could overreact. Short of that, I don't think they will overreact, and they will keep doing what they've been doing since I was there in 2003. At that time, the problem was something called Article 23. They keep subverting Hong Kong's liberty in subtle ways until 2047, when it's barely noticeable. And then, so my pessimism is more we're already halfway through almost the 50-year period, that we've got one more generation, and it will be a steady, gradual decline of liberty, and then it will just be another Chinese city.
Ray, I have to say, when I was watching that report, I found myself asking, what's it like to live in a place where a clock is ticking toward a deadline that could mean a completely different political system and a loss of liberty? What can you tell us? What that means for daily life for people living there?
It's actually very desperate for the young generation in Hong Kong, because we grow in a place where we can enjoy freedom and the rule of law and a little bit democracy. But when we look at a Chinese city where the people have no freedom, they have no freedom of speech, it's really desperate, and we don't want to live in such a city. That's why we go out to the streets to fight for democracy in order to keep distance from China.
Carrie, let me come back to the question of pressure from outside. Ray talked about Donald Trump saying that he would bring up Hong Kong's status when he meets, apparently, with Xi Jinping on the margins of the G20. To what degree, though, would you really expect any country right now to truly stand up for Hong Kong vis-a-vis China when there are so many tensions already between, for instance, the US and China?
After these big protests, actually, many countries, including the EU, I think they put out a statement saying that they support the protesters and they think that all these protesters, they have their rights to voice their opinion, but then they didn't really make it very obvious that they want democracy in Hong Kong. And but I must say, I think Hong Kong people this time around, compared to 2014, they are really way smarter and more clever because we see a lot of protests organized in different countries, in Australia, in the US, in Europe, and they are really trying to get as much international attention as possible. So with the international pressure, I would say it did something to for the government to back down a bit, but as for China, I don't think it really plays a big role in China's decision on how they want to govern Hong Kong.
Andreas, how much do Hong Kong's stability and prosperity matter both to the West and also to China? As I was looking at the figures, I found it quite interesting to see that Hong Kong's share of China's overall GDP has dropped quite dramatically. So, question is, would China really care if Hong Kong were to go into an economic tailspin?
They would care, but probably not as much. What China has up to now needed Hong Kong for is as a finance center that brings capital in and out. So a lot of IPOs have not just been happening in Shanghai, but also in Hong Kong because of the English common law. Yeah. And so forth. But what you've been seeing for many, many years now is a change in the division of labor among the Asian financial centers. So, for instance, a lot of the currency stuff is now in Singapore. A lot of the direct investment in China is increasingly in Shanghai. So, from China's point of view, that is part of the long time horizon. They're hoping to arrange things so they need Hong Kong less and less, and that Shanghai plays a larger and larger role with support by Singapore and Hong Kong and Taipei and Seoul and Tokyo. So China will manage that and not care too much. And as far as the West, unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic either that Donald Trump cares a hoot about this. He cares about China in terms of a trade war, and his advisors are telling him, which is true, there's a potential for a hot military war at some point. And he cares about North Korea, where Xi Jinping has been staging himself, perhaps to get out of the news cycle with Hong Kong pictures there. He's walking around with the North Korean dictator who Donald Trump is trying to be chummy with. Donald Trump does not care really about the freedoms and liberties of Hong Kong, and the Europeans and the Germans care even less because they're being ground up. They had their trading mentality. They're being ground up. Germany, in particular, between this Sino-American trade war, they want that settled, and they don't want a larger war in the region. And when push comes to shove, they're not going to make Hong Kong something that they would, risk capital in.
Carrie, if I come back to our title, whether the power struggle between Beijing and Hong Kong has simply been postponed at best, would you say that pressure from outside is essential in order for that power struggle to go Hong Kong's way? And if so, are you confident that Hong Kong can be more than a bargaining chip that both China and the West would happily throw away if they need to?
I would say a lot of international business set up their branch in Hong Kong, especially because there's the rule of law and they trust the legal system in Hong Kong. And so I think economy is really a bargaining chip for Hong Kong to win this battle. Maybe actually it's the only chip they can use. Because to be honest, I don't think the international community really pay a lot of attention to human rights or the democracy in Hong Kong per se. But yeah.
Ray, I was interested to see when I was reading up a little bit about your life here in Germany that you have said that Germany's experience of reunification gives you hope for Hong Kong. Can you just tell us, to close the show, why that is?
Because I met some German people, they have told me that actually they never thought that West Germany and the East Germany will eventually reunited, but somehow it happened. So they told us never lose my hope to a dictatorship. They will eventually collapse.
So looking toward that power struggle that our title talks about, how do you think it will come out?
I think, first of all, the international community should constantly give pressure to the Hong Kong government and the China government. So I hope the German Chancellor Angela Merkel will raise the Hong Kong issue in G20.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to you out there for tuning in. See you soon.